Steady on, boy. Just a little further.
There are some decisions a man makes in pride or fear, certain in the moment that he is protecting something worth protecting, only to realize decades later that he was the one tearing it apart with his own hands. He may walk away from people who never once stopped loving him. He may convince himself that what he is owed matters more than what he already has. He may spend a lifetime chasing a single idea of what a family is supposed to look like, never noticing the real one standing quietly in front of him the whole time. This is the story of a man named Thomas Calloway, and the 4 generations of land that nearly cost him everything that actually mattered. The Calloway farm had stood on the same stretch of Kentucky bluegrass since Thomas's great-grandfather first cleared the fields with a mule and a single-share plow. By the time Thomas was born, the farm had passed from father to son 3 times over, and his own father, Earl, never let him forget what that meant. Earl had 2 older sisters who'd grown up working that same land from sunup to dark, and yet neither of their names was ever mentioned when Earl talked about who the farm would belong to one day. Thomas grew up believing land only moved in one direction, down through sons, and he never thought to ask why his aunts had spent their whole lives earning an inheritance neither of them would ever receive. Earl passed when Thomas was 26, and at the funeral, Thomas watched his Aunt Ruth stand at the very back of the church, dry-eyed and silent, having spent 40 years keeping the farm's books and raising chickens that fed half the county during hard winters. Nobody asked her to speak. Nobody thanked her for any of it. Thomas felt something twist in his chest watching her stand there, but he let the feeling pass without examining it, the same way he let most uncomfortable things pass, and he took over the farm exactly the way Earl had always intended. He met Margaret Hayes, known to everyone as Maggie, at the county fair the August he turned 25, drawn first to the sound of her laughing at something her younger brother had said, then to the easy, grounded way she moved through a crowded midway like nothing in the world could rattle her. Maggie had grown up the only daughter of a schoolteacher, raised with very little money but more love than she knew what to do with, and she saw in Thomas a hard-working man with steady hands and a farm that had survived 4 generations of Kentucky winters. She fell for the version of him that existed before the weight of his father's expectations ever fully settled onto his shoulders. They married the following October in the same white clapboard church where Maggie had been baptized, with the reception held right there in the Calloway barn, strung with string lights and folding tables borrowed from half the families in the county. Thomas's mother, Dorothy, spent the better part of the evening reminding anyone who would listen that the Calloway name needed a grandson if the farm was going to mean anything in another generation. Maggie brushed it off that night, certain nothing could touch the happiness she felt standing in that barn with the man she loved. On their wedding night, sitting together on the porch swing long after the guests had gone home, Thomas took Maggie's hands and told her, with complete sincerity, that he didn't care what their family ended up looking like, only that they built it together. He told her his father had been a hard man who measured worth by bloodlines and last names, and he promised he would never become that kind of husband or that kind of father. Maggie believed him completely, because in that moment, swinging gently under a sky full of stars, she had no reason in the world not to. In those early years, Thomas kept every promise he'd made. He came in from the fields in time for supper most nights. He drove 40 minutes into town just to bring Maggie a milkshake from the drive-in when she was craving one. He held her hand at church, which his farmhands ribbed him about constantly, since a man running cattle and corn wasn't supposed to act soft in front of his wife. Thomas laughed it off. For a season, he was genuinely happy simply being married to a woman who loved him without a single condition attached. Their first child arrived 2 years later. It was a girl. Maggie named her Olivia, and when the doctor placed the baby in her arms, she cried the way only a new mother holding her firstborn can cry. Thomas forced a smile and said, "Well, she's healthy anyway," a sentence that should have carried joy but came out sounding like a small disappointment, dressed up as relief. Maggie noticed the flatness in his voice, but she told herself fatherhood would grow on him in time, the way it does for some men. Dorothy visited the hospital room the next morning, looked at the baby for exactly 4 seconds, and said, "Well, there's still time for a grandson." Maggie said nothing back. She told herself, grandmothers sometimes spoke carelessly, without ever meaning the damage their words could leave behind, though she never repeated that sentence to a single soul, not even to Thomas, for years afterward. Olivia grew into a bright, fearless little girl who lived for the sound of her father's truck rattling up the gravel driveway each evening. She would run barefoot across the yard the moment she heard the engine, climbing up onto the running board before he'd even cut the ignition. For a while, even Thomas couldn't resist her joy, letting her ride along beside him on slow trips out to check the fence lines, both of them singing badly to whatever was playing on the truck radio. But underneath that affection, the old belief never loosened its hold on him. When Maggie became pregnant a second time, Thomas drove 2 hours to a fertility clinic in Lexington that advertised gender selection services, paying for consultations the farm's tight budget genuinely could not afford. The doctor there was careful to explain the limits of what science could actually promise him, but Thomas left each appointment more convinced than ever that this pregnancy would finally give him a son, certain enough that he spent money the farm needed elsewhere just to keep the appointments coming. The second child was a girl. They named her Hannah. This time, Thomas's disappointment wasn't softened by a forced smile. He stood at the foot of the hospital bed with his hat still on, said nothing for almost a full minute, and finally muttered, "Yeah, she's a pretty one," in a voice that carried no warmth at all. He left for the farm that same evening, claiming a sick cow needed tending that, as it turned out, didn't exist. From that point on, the warmth in the house began fading in small, almost unnoticeable ways. Thomas started staying out in the barn later than the work actually required. He complained more about money, about the bank loan, about anything that gave him an excuse to be somewhere else. When Olivia ran to hug him at the door, he sometimes set her down quickly and told her to go find her mother, as though affection itself had become something he no longer had the patience for. Maggie noticed every shift, but she kept it from the girls as best she could, making sure they still said goodnight to their father every evening, and still believed, in their small hearts, that he loved them the way fathers were supposed to. Dorothy's pressure never let up. At Sunday dinner not long after Hannah's birth, she set down her fork and told Thomas plainly, in front of the whole table, that 4 generations of Callaway land had no future without a grandson to run it. "Your daddy and his daddy built this place for sons," she said, "not for granddaughters who'll just marry off and take some other man's name." Maggie excused herself to the kitchen rather than sit through the rest of that meal, and Thomas, instead of standing up for his wife, simply let the comment settle over the table like nothing had been said at all. When Maggie became pregnant a third time, Thomas's desperation grew louder and harder to hide. He drove her back to Lexington for another round of expensive consultations, asking the staff questions they weren't permitted to answer with any certainty. Maggie, exhausted and increasingly frightened for the baby's health, finally confronted him one night in the kitchen. "You don't understand," he told her. "This farm needs a son to carry it." Maggie looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And what exactly are your daughters, Thomas?" He had no answer. He simply walked out to the barn and didn't come back inside until well past midnight. The third child was a girl. They named her Charlotte. Thomas didn't come to the hospital at all that day, sending one of his farmhands with an envelope of cash instead, as though fatherhood could be fulfilled secondhand. When Maggie came home with the baby, Thomas barely glanced into the bassinet sitting in the corner of the bedroom. Something in him closed that night, permanently, the way a gate stops swinging once the hinge has finally rusted through. He began disappearing for days at a stretch, claiming work that kept him at the far edges of the property. He stopped eating the suppers Maggie cooked. He called her unlucky in front of the children more than once, a word that Olivia, old enough by then to understand insult even without fully understanding cruelty, never once forgot. It was around this same stretch of time that Thomas met Brittany Sears, the young veterinary assistant who started coming out to the farm to help with the cattle after their longtime vet retired. She was confident in a way that flattered his bruised pride, listening patiently while he complained about a life he felt had cheated him out of something he deserved. She never once asked about his daughters, and Thomas found that silence strangely comforting, as though his daughters were a debt nobody was making him answer for anymore. Their visits out to check the herd became something else entirely before either of them said it out loud, and eventually Thomas stopped bothering to hide it at all. One evening, He brought Brittany straight into the farmhouse he still shared with Maggie and their 3 daughters. Maggie was at the stove when she heard unfamiliar laughter coming from the front room. She walked out to find Thomas standing beside a woman dressed for an occasion that didn't exist out here. "Maggie, this is Brittany," he said, without ceremony. "She's going to be staying on for a while." Maggie's voice came out small. Staying on as what, exactly? Thomas's answer was colder than anything he'd said to her in 13 years of marriage. "As my wife." Olivia, listening from the hallway, would remember that single word for the rest of her life. Maggie gripped the edge of the kitchen counter to keep herself steady. "Thomas," she whispered, "what did I ever do to deserve this?" His reply landed like a verdict already decided. "You gave me 3 daughters. I need a son for this land." Maggie didn't scream. She didn't break a single dish. She walked into the bedroom, gathered up baby Charlotte, and sat on the edge of the bed in a silence heavier than any amount of shouting could have ever been. Brittany settled into the farmhouse as though she'd always belonged there. She criticized Maggie's cooking in front of the girls. She rearranged the kitchen without asking a single question. She told Hannah her braids looked messy, and told Olivia her school clothes looked like hand-me-downs, which, in fairness, most of them were. Thomas defended Brittany every single time, telling Maggie she was being too sensitive about all of it. The girls grew quieter by the week. The farmhouse that once rang with Olivia's laughter on the porch grew heavier with every passing month. When Brittany became pregnant, Thomas turned into a man Maggie barely recognized anymore. He drove her into Lexington for every single appointment. He talked to her stomach in the evenings out on the porch, promising the baby a life of comfort and inheritance he had never once promised his own daughters. Maggie watched some of it through the kitchen window, not out of jealousy but out of genuine disbelief that the same man who had ignored 3 pregnancies could behave this way now that the stakes finally matched what he'd always wanted. When the baby came, it was a boy. Thomas's celebration was the talk of the whole county for months afterward. He hosted a hog roast out by the barn that ran 2 days straight. He hired a band to play on a flatbed trailer parked in the side field. Relatives who hadn't set foot on the farm in years suddenly showed up with gifts, calling Thomas a man who had finally been rewarded for his patience. He named the boy Thomas Calloway II, a name that left no doubt the family line had finally been secured the way Earl always demanded it would be. Maggie stood at the edge of that 2-day celebration with her 3 daughters pressed close against her, watching cousins and neighbors celebrate a child the way nobody had ever once celebrated Olivia, Hannah, or Charlotte. Not long after, Thomas made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He told Maggie she had to leave the farm. When she dropped to her knees in the kitchen and asked where exactly she was supposed to go with 3 girls and no income of her own, Thomas's response was as cold as a January frost across the bluegrass. "You're a grown woman. You'll land somewhere." Maggie packed 2 suitcases that same night. She took nothing that belonged to the Calloway name, only the few things that belonged to the girls and to herself. As they pulled out of the gravel driveway, Olivia turned around once in the back seat, certain her father would come running after the truck. He stood on the porch and didn't move an inch. Maggie had no real family left to lean on. Her own parents had both passed years earlier, and her younger brother had moved out west for work and rarely called more than once or twice a year. Maggie understood, without anyone having to spell it out for her, that raising 3 daughters from here on out was a job she would be doing almost entirely on her own. What followed were years that tested Maggie in ways she could never have braced herself for. She rented a small house on the edge of town, with a furnace that barely held against the cold, and on the worst winter nights, she would pile every blanket they owned onto the girls' shared bed and sit up reading by lamplight until she was sure they were warm enough to finally sleep. There were nights she skipped supper entirely just so the girls could eat seconds. She took in sewing and alterations after the girls were in bed, cleaned houses for families across town on the weekends, and picked up early shifts at the diner downtown just to keep the lights running. A woman named Ruth Ann, who ran the town's small public library, became one of the few people who showed Maggie real kindness during that stretch. Ruth Ann kept the library open late some evenings, so the girls would have somewhere warm and well lit to do their homework, and she never once mentioned it was technically against the rules. "Your girls aren't going to be cold and hungry forever," Ruth Ann told Maggie once, "but you've got to stay standing long enough to see it through to the other side." Maggie held on to that sentence the way some people hold on to scripture, repeating it to herself on the nights despair tried to settle in for good. Years later, once she finally had the means to do it, Maggie quietly funded a children's reading room addition to that same library, never explaining why, only saying someone had once kept the lights on for her family when nobody else would. Olivia, watching her mother's sacrifice up close every single day, became fiercely disciplined at school, finishing her homework at the library most evenings before walking home in the dark. She was teased once by classmates for wearing the same 2 pairs of jeans on rotation for an entire winter, and she came home in tears asking her mother why life had to be this hard. Maggie held her and said only, "Hard doesn't mean hopeless, baby." Olivia repeated that line to herself years later through every grueling semester of law school. Hannah grew gentle in a household that had every reason to grow bitter instead. She often gave up her own supper portion whenever Charlotte complained of being hungry, telling her mother she simply wasn't hungry that night, though Maggie always quietly set a little extra aside for her anyway. Charlotte, the boldest of the 3 by a wide margin, once stood her ground against a landlord who tried to shortchange her mother on a repair deposit, demanding the correct amount in a voice far too commanding for a child her age. Maggie scolded her for the boldness in front of the landlord, but privately, she was proud of the fire burning steady in her youngest daughter, the same fire that would later draw Charlotte to animals too frightened or hurt to speak up for themselves. Years into the separation, Maggie and Brittany crossed paths once at the feed store in town, an encounter neither woman had planned for. Brittany pulled up in a brand new truck Thomas had bought her, glancing at Maggie's worn coat with a small, satisfied smile, as if the contrast between their lives confirmed something she'd always believed about who had come out ahead. Maggie said nothing back. She nodded politely and finished loading her own truck, unwilling to let one woman's smugness borrow even a minute of her peace. She had no idea yet how completely the years ahead would turn that moment inside out. Meanwhile, Thomas believed he had finally gotten the life he was owed. Brittany enjoyed everything the farm's income could provide, but comfort never seemed to be quite enough for her. She spent freely, accused Thomas of hiding money whenever a season ran lean, and reminded him often that she had given him something his first wife never could. Tommy, raised without a single meaningful consequence, grew more difficult by the year, almost as soon as he could talk back to the farmhands. He demanded a 4-wheeler the moment he turned 12 and a lifted truck the day he turned 16. And Thomas, terrified of disappointing the son he'd waited so long for, signed off on both without a second thought. By the time Tommy reached high school, the pattern had hardened into something genuinely dangerous. He was suspended twice for fighting, and both times Thomas blamed the other boys rather than his own son. He was caught with vape pens and worse hidden in the barn at 15, and Thomas quietly paid the school to keep the incident off the boy's record rather than sit him down for an honest conversation. When Tommy started skipping school entirely to run with older guys known throughout the county for stealing farm equipment and reselling it, Thomas called it just being a teenager, refusing to see the warning signs piling up right under his own roof. The first real warning came when Tommy was picked up by the county sheriff for being present during a break-in at a neighboring farm's equipment shed, though he walked away without charges after Thomas quietly covered the damages and made a generous donation to the volunteer fire department the sheriff happened to chair. Thomas never sat his son down about it beyond a half-hearted lecture delivered mostly out of obligation. Brittany, when she heard, brushed it off as boys being boys, the same excuse she would lean on again and again whenever Tommy's behavior demanded a real response neither of them was willing to give him. Years rolled forward. Olivia earned a scholarship that covered most of her tuition, the rest pieced together through a part-time job, and a small fund Ruth Ann and 2 of Maggie's longtime cleaning clients quietly put together for her. She studied law, driven by a need to understand a system that had never once protected her mother through any of it. Hannah went into nursing, drawn to a profession built entirely on care, the very thing she'd received so much of from Maggie and so little of from Thomas. Charlotte set her sights on veterinary school, drawn from childhood toward creatures that couldn't speak up for themselves, the way her own family once couldn't either. Hannah's path through nursing school was its own quiet grind. She couldn't always afford the textbooks, so she spent long evenings copying notes from classmates who could. During one stretch of clinical rotations, she fainted from sheer exhaustion after closing the diner the night before and reporting for hospital duty at 5 the next morning. A senior nurse who noticed how hard she pushed herself quietly took her under her wing, teaching her not just procedure, but the kind of patience no textbook could ever fully capture. Hannah carried that lesson into every single shift she would ever work for the rest of her career. Charlotte's path through veterinary school nearly ended before it began. Tuition ran far higher than nursing or law school, and a private loan she'd counted on fell through during her second year, leaving her scrambling to cover the gap with almost no notice. She seriously considered dropping out entirely, too proud to tell her mother how close she'd come to losing everything she'd worked toward. But Maggie, sensing her daughter pulling away during phone calls, drew the truth out of her one evening and said simply, "A setback isn't the end of your story, Charlotte. It's just one hard chapter in a much longer book." Charlotte found a smaller regional program willing to work with her financially, and she finished 2 years later than planned, but finished all the same. It was around this stretch of time that Thomas came closer than he ever would again to actually reaching out. A neighbor mentioned in passing one afternoon that he'd seen Olivia's name in the county paper for a scholarship announcement. Thomas said nothing about it at the time, but that weekend, without telling Brittany, he drove out past the small rental house where he knew Maggie had once lived with the girls. He parked across the street, hands resting on the wheel, and sat there for nearly 20 minutes. He couldn't be certain which window had once been theirs, but he sat there anyway, something tightening in his chest he didn't have a name for. He almost stepped out of the truck. He almost walked across that street. But pride, the very same pride his own father had handed down to him decades earlier, told him that going back now would mean admitting he'd been wrong for years, and Thomas wasn't ready yet to be a man who admitted things like that. He started the engine and drove home, telling himself there would be another chance. There wouldn't be. One night, years into their new life, Olivia asked her mother a question that had clearly been sitting in her chest for a long while. "Mama, after everything he did, why don't you hate him?" Maggie thought about it carefully before answering. "Because bitterness is its own kind of prison, Olivia. I left his house. I'm not about to let him live rent-free in my heart, too." Olivia carried that line with her into every courtroom she would ever stand in. Thomas's decline started slow, the way most declines do, with small cracks that look harmless, until the whole structure finally gives way. 3 lean harvest years in a row, driven by drought and falling grain prices, drained the farm's reserves faster than Thomas was willing to admit out loud. Brittany, sensing the shift in their finances, grew colder and sharper, accusing him openly of failing to provide the life she'd signed on for. Tommy, now older and running with friends who had increasingly expensive habits, demanded money constantly. For trucks, for parties, for things Thomas no longer fully understood but paid for anyway, terrified of losing the one relationship he'd sacrificed everything else to keep. Thomas sold off the back 40 acres to cover a bad season. Then he sold a good portion of the cattle herd. Then he started borrowing against the rest of the land from a lender who specialized in farms already running out of options, watching the interest eat away at whatever pride he had left with every missed payment. He told himself, night after night, that the next harvest would turn things around, the way men talk themselves into believing, right up until the moment they simply can't anymore. The breaking point came the night Tommy got arrested. He'd been present during the theft of a neighbor's combine harvester, caught alongside friends who scattered the second the sheriff's truck pulled in. Thomas spent nearly everything he had left trying to find a lawyer good enough to keep his son out of real prison time. Brittany, instead of standing by him through the crisis, turned the blame entirely onto Thomas. "You didn't raise that boy right," she shouted one evening, loud enough for it to carry clear out to the barn. Thomas, stunned, shot back, "We raised him together." Brittany's reply cut deeper than anything that had come before it. "No, you raised your son. I just gave birth to him." That sentence broke something in Thomas that had been holding firm for years. For the first time since the night he sent them away, he let himself remember Olivia's small hand, reaching for his on the running board of his truck. He remembered Hannah quietly bringing him sweet tea on evenings he came home short-tempered and tired. He remembered Charlotte as an infant, asleep against his chest before his heart hardened for good. He remembered the truck parked across from that little rental house, and the moment he drove away instead of walking inside. But pride still wouldn't let him go looking for them, even now. He told himself it was too late, that the damage was already permanent, and he let that excuse silence whatever conscience he had left. The years that followed stripped Thomas of nearly everything he'd traded his family for. Brittany eventually left, following a wealthier man who could give her the life Thomas no longer could provide. Tommy, released after a brutal legal process that left the family with almost nothing, disappeared for long stretches, only resurfacing when he needed cash, turning hostile the second Thomas couldn't deliver. The farmhouse Thomas once filled with celebration sat mostly empty, dust gathering on furniture nobody used anymore. The silence inside it far heavier than anything Maggie had ever endured in that cold little rental on the edge of town. Then his health started failing, the way it usually does. Quietly at first, and then all at once. Thomas developed a serious heart condition that ate through whatever savings remained. Old friends who'd once celebrated his good fortune kept their distance from his decline. One afternoon, walking unsteadily out toward the mailbox at the end of the gravel drive, Thomas collapsed. A neighbor who barely knew him anymore called for an ambulance. At the hospital, a nurse reviewing new admissions paused on a chart with the name Thomas Calloway. She looked up at the man on the gurney, pale, frail, barely conscious, and recognized him instantly despite the years and the suffering carved into his face. It was Hannah, the daughter he'd once dismissed with a flat, "She's a pretty one," in a tone meant to wound rather than celebrate. For a long moment, Hannah couldn't move. The man responsible for so many cold winters and hungry nights lay in front of her now, completely powerless. Thomas's eyes opened slowly, confusion clearing into recognition. "Hannah?" he whispered. She nodded, blinking back tears she hadn't expected to feel. "Daddy," she said quietly, and Thomas wept, deep and broken, the weight of every wasted year finally cracking through his pride. "I'm so sorry," he managed. Hannah didn't hug him right away. She remembered too much. But she also remembered her mother's words about bitterness being its own prison. So she stayed, made sure he got proper care, and then called her sisters. Olivia, now a respected attorney known around the courthouse for representing women in difficult family law and inheritance cases, arrived first. Charlotte, now running her own large animal veterinary practice serving farms across 3 counties, showed up shortly after. Thomas couldn't bring himself to meet their eyes. "I was a fool," he confessed. "I thought I needed a son to carry this land. I never once realized I was throwing away my whole future trying to get one." Olivia's response was steady, neither cruel nor soft. "You didn't just leave Mama. You abandoned 3 girls who loved you without asking for a single thing in return." Charlotte's voice trembled with old pain finally finding a voice. "Do you know how many nights Mama went without supper? Do you know how many nights we went to bed hungry on that farm you cared about more than us?" Thomas had no answer that could undo any of it. The silence stretched long enough that a nurse passing in the hallway slowed her steps, sensing the weight in the room. Thomas finally spoke again, smaller this time. "I'm not asking either of you to forgive me today," he said. "I just needed you to know I finally see it, all of it, clearly, after 30 years of refusing to look." Charlotte crossed her arms. "Seeing it isn't the same as having lived it, Daddy." Olivia said nothing further, stepping out into the hallway to collect herself, unwilling to let him watch how close his words had come to cracking something she'd spent years sealing shut. He asked, voice breaking, "About Maggie." The daughters exchanged a glance heavy with history. Maggie was alive, shaped by suffering, into someone steadier and more at peace than the young woman Thomas had once cast aside. The daughters had pooled their resources years earlier to buy her a small house on the edge of town with a garden she'd always wanted, fulfilling a promise young Charlotte had once made, sitting on a cold mattress in a rental house with a furnace that barely worked. When Thomas, discharged but weakened, begged to see Maggie, she didn't agree right away. "Some wounds," she explained gently to her daughters, "aren't meant to be reopened carelessly." But after many days of thinking it over, she relented, letting Hannah bring him out to her place. Thomas pulled into the driveway and sat there a moment, struck by the quiet beauty of it, flowers lining the walkway, sunlight settling calmly over a life built entirely without him. Maggie was sitting on the porch reading, and when their eyes met, decades passed silently between them in a single look. He lowered himself onto one knee at the bottom of the porch steps, his voice shaking. "Maggie, I threw away what I was actually given. I rejected you. I rejected our daughters. I thought a son and that land were everything, and my pride cost me more than I'll ever be able to pay back." Maggie set down her book slowly. "Thomas, I forgave you years ago, not because you earned it, but because I needed the peace for myself." Thomas wept, finally understanding that forgiveness and getting back what he'd lost were two completely different gifts. Maggie never took him back as her husband. That chapter of her life had closed for good. But she allowed her daughters to care for him through whatever time he had left, not because he'd earned it, but because they'd been raised with hearts far better than the one that had once turned them away. Tommy showed up one final time, not out of any real remorse, but out of entitlement, demanding what remained of the family land as the only son in the family. Olivia stood across from him, with the full weight of her profession behind her, and answered calmly, "Inheritance isn't a reward for gender, Tommy. It's a reward for responsibility, and you've shown none." Tommy left angry, and Thomas, watching his son drive off for what would be the last time, finally understood the difference between the child he'd celebrated and the children who had quietly become his real legacy all along. He never saw Tommy again, and some part of him, however quietly, had already made peace with that long before his body gave out. In his final weeks, Thomas grew gentler than he had ever allowed himself to be. Olivia read to him in the evenings. Hannah personally monitored his care at the hospital. Charlotte quietly covered whatever he needed without ever once mentioning the cost out loud. Maggie, from a respectful distance, prayed for a peaceful end for a man whose cruelty had shaped her hardest years, but whose regret, however late, still deserved some measure of mercy. One evening, gathering his daughters close, Thomas whispered, "I spent my whole life chasing a son to carry this land, when God had already handed me 3 daughters worth more than every acre of it." He asked them only to never make his mistake, to never reject a blessing, simply because it didn't arrive looking the way they expected. That night he slept peacefully for the first time in years and didn't wake up again. Maggie, told the next morning by a phone call from Hannah, sat quietly for a long while before saying only that she hoped, wherever he'd gone, he'd finally found the peace his pride had denied him for most of his life. At the funeral, Maggie stood before the small gathering of mourners and said something many of them would repeat for years afterward. "Thomas made some deep mistakes," she said quietly, "but maybe his life can teach every parent listening today that a daughter isn't a disappointment, and a daughter isn't a burden. A daughter can be the very hand God uses to lift you back up when life knocks you flat on the ground." Olivia, Hannah, and Charlotte stood beside her, no longer the frightened girls who once rode out of that gravel driveway with nothing but 2 suitcases and each other. They stood as proof that rejection doesn't decide your future, and that one mother's sacrifice can raise 3 kinds of greatness out of the hardest possible beginning. Brittany showed up at the funeral uninvited, standing at the back of the small crowd in clothes far less expensive than the ones she used to wear during her years with Thomas. She didn't approach the daughters, and they didn't approach her. A few of the older women in town whispered about the years she'd spent tearing apart a family that was never hers to claim, but Maggie, watching from where she stood, felt no satisfaction in Brittany's quiet fall from grace. She'd buried her own bitterness long before that day, and she had no interest in digging it back up over a woman who had simply played her own small part in a story Thomas had written all on his own. 5 years after Thomas's funeral, that cold little rental house with the failing furnace had become little more than a story Maggie told her daughters to remind them how far they'd traveled together. Olivia's law practice had grown into one specifically built around supporting women navigating abandonment and unfair custody and inheritance battles, her name now respected throughout the county courthouse and several others nearby. Hannah's career had taken her into hospital leadership, where she pushed hard for programs supporting struggling rural families, quietly covering unpaid balances for new mothers who reminded her constantly of her own childhood. Charlotte's veterinary practice had grown into the largest large animal practice in 3 counties, employing a staff of young women she personally mentored, many of whom had grown up on farms not so different from the one she'd once been pushed off of. In the practice's 5th year, Charlotte did something none of them saw coming. She bought back the original 40 acres of Callaway land her father had sold off first, the same stretch he'd parted with to cover a single bad harvest, and turned it into a non-profit therapy farm offering equine programs for kids dealing with trauma and grief. She kept one weathered fence post from the original property line standing at the edge of the new program's pasture, not as tribute to her father, but as a quiet reminder of exactly how far the family that land once tried to push out had managed to come without him. Every year, on the anniversary of the night Maggie drove out of that gravel driveway with 2 suitcases and 3 daughters, the 4 women gathered for supper, free of anger, full only of quiet gratitude for how far survival had carried them. Tommy was never seen in the county again after that final confrontation at the hospital. Some said he'd headed out west, chasing money he believed he was still owed. Others said he stayed close by, still blaming everyone except himself for everything he'd lost along the way. Maggie's younger brother, the one who drifted out west for work decades earlier and called only once or twice a year, eventually moved back to Kentucky once he retired, settling close enough to visit on Sundays. It wasn't the family safety net Maggie had needed during those hardest years, but it became, in time, a comfort she hadn't expected to receive this late in her story. Maggie often reminded her daughters, whenever they gathered around her table, that the family Thomas threw away had never actually been empty. He'd simply been too blinded by pride to recognize the value standing quietly right beside him the whole time, and by the time he finally saw it clearly, most of his life had already been spent looking in entirely the wrong direction. If this story moved you even a little, share it with someone in your life who needs to hear it today. And if you've ever felt like you weren't enough simply because of who you were born as, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from tonight. We see you, and we're genuinely glad you're here with us. Before you head out, make sure you're subscribed to Prime Tales Hub, because stories exactly like this one get shared here every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Turn on notifications so nothing slips past you. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.